Bonjour, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the virtual learning series Departmental Showcase hosted by the Federal Youth Network. Je m'appelle Guillaume Kofi. I will begin by acknowledging that I am here on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, and I encourage all of you to acknowledge the land you're on as well. As we move through today's session, please share your questions by using the Q&A button in the official language of your choice. You can also vote for questions that you like by clicking the thumbs up button. Aujourd'hui, nous avons un autre ministère dans le cadre du ministère sous les projecteurs. Je voudrais rappeler que pendant cette session, si vous avez des questions, évidemment, c'est ce que nous voudrions. Si vous avez des questions à poser, utilisez le bouton Q&A ou questions-réponses dans la langue officielle de votre choix. Si une question aussi a été déjà posée et que vous l'aimez, vous voudrez bien l'avoir posée, veuillez s'il vous plaît utiliser le pouce en l'air, thumbs up. Aujourd'hui, en ce beau jour, beau soleil dehors, nous avons le plaisir de recevoir Pêche et Océan Canada. Je voudrais laisser la parole maintenant aux deux personnes modératrices, Stacy et Ryan. Merci à vous.
Merci beaucoup, Guillaume. So hello, everyone, and welcome to the Fisheries and Oceans Canada and the Canadian Coast Guard Departmental Showcase. Thank you so much to the Federal Youth Network for giving us the opportunity to highlight the great work being done every day in our department and across the country. Alors, bonjour à tous et bienvenue au Ministère sous les projecteurs de Pêche et Océan Canada et de la Garde côtière canadienne. Merci beaucoup au Réseau des jeunes fonctionnaires fédéraux de nous donner l'occasion aujourd'hui de mettre en lumière l'excellent travail accompli chaque jour par notre ministère dans l'ensemble du pays. Je m'appelle Stacy Réel et j'aimerais d'abord débuter par souligner que je participe aujourd'hui à cette rencontre depuis le territoire traditionnel non cédé de la Première Nation Comox. Je suis la présidente régionale de votre réseau professionnel ou le VRP du MPO et de la GCC. En plus de mon rôle au sein du réseau, je suis biologiste pour la planification spatiale marine pour la Côte-Nord avec la branche de la gestion de l'écosystème dans la région du Pacifique. Je suis également accompagnée de notre coordonnateur stratégique étudiant, Ryan Wong, qui sera co-animateur avec moi.
Hi, everyone. As Stacey mentioned, welcome everyone to our session today, and I'm looking forward to speaking with all of you and to introduce our panelists. My name is Ryan Wong, and I am the Student Strategic Coordinator of the Your Professional Network. I am also a student currently studying at the University of Ottawa, and I'm joining everybody on Anishinaabe Algonquin territory today.
Thank you, Ryan. Before continuing, we did want to take the time to acknowledge the devastating and unprecedented weather systems that have been ravaging the country from floods to extreme wildfires. Our thoughts and gratefulness go out to the DFO and CCG employees and other Government of Canada employees, first responders, firefighters, and all of those who are working in these difficult times. For anyone who is or knows someone in these affected areas, we hope that you and your loved ones are safe. Nous avons eu tous les deux la chance d'enrichir notre vie professionnelle grâce à notre participation au VRP. Le VRP s'efforce de cultiver un lieu de travail inclusif et diversifié en offrant à tous les employés des possibilités de développement professionnel, de réseautage et d'apprentissage. Nous comptons actuellement plus de 300 membres dans tout le pays et certaines de ces possibilités comprennent des événements internes au MPO ou la GCC, mais aussi des initiatives interministérielles qui sont toujours un bon moyen d'établir des liens supplémentaires et de voir ce que font les autres ministères. La série de présentations Ministère sous les projecteurs est un bon exemple de ce type de collaboration.
And while we both only represent the YPN, the Your Professional Network, at today's event, we also wanted to highlight the many other networks that are doing incredible work to make DFO and the Coast Guard a wonderful place to work. If you have any questions about any of the groups that you see on the screen in front of you, or about YPN or any of our workings in the department generally, please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd also like to take the time and wish everyone a very happy Public Service Pride Week this week. And I guess with that, we wanted to begin by perhaps breaking the ice and also to ask our participants some questions. So if you are able to guide your eyes to a screen that will be popping up briefly. There we go. So our first question is, if DFO and the Coast Guard was a superhero, which one would they be? Si le MPO GCC était un super-héros, lequel serait-il? That's our first question. So if you can perhaps take some time to think about that. And that really depends on how much knowledge perhaps you have about the department, or, that could also help guide us with how to address any questions that you have. And then we have our second question, which I guess is kind of by extension, what is DFO CCG superpower?
We'll just give a few more seconds before we should see the results. Well, it seems as we're just figuring out the results on our end, let's keep going, and we'll get that figured out and show what folks thought afterwards. Alors, avant de continuer, nous voulions vous présenter visuellement une partie du travail qu'on effectue au ministère. Alors, nous allons vous montrer une brève vidéo qui va mettre en valeur ce travail. Thank you, Ryan, for sharing that video. And I have just obtained the results of the poll. And without surprise, the superhero that was identified was Aquaman. Some had Wonder Woman as well. And in terms of superpower, they ranged from controlling the water, cleaning up the oceans. D'autres pouvoirs qui ont été nommés, être capable de parler aux poissons et aux baleines, être capable de respirer sans problème sous l'eau. Alors, on a vraiment une variété de pouvoirs qui ont été nommés.
Wonderful. Well, as you can see, the department not only does work aboard vessels or in the water, but we also have a lot of labs and office buildings across the country. And since being founded in 1868, the work at DFO has been varied and continues to reflect the 4 core responsibilities of the department, which are fisheries, aquatic ecosystems, marine navigation, and marine operations and response.
Le MPO et la Garde côtière canadienne comptent plus de 14 000 employés répartis sur plus de 400 sites à travers le Canada. Et ensemble, ces employés collaborent à la réalisation du mandat du ministère qui consiste à gérer les pêches du Canada et à protéger ses eaux par plusieurs moyens. Et comme vous pouvez voir sur l'écran devant vous, ça donne un petit peu plus de détails au niveau de notre mandat.
All right, and in front of you right now is the DFO regional map. And right here, this graphic represents the regions of the department, which include the Arctic, the Pacific, the Ontario and Prairie, the Quebec, the Newfoundland and Labrador, the Gulf, and the Maritimes regions. And on the Coast Guard side are the 4 regions, which include the Arctic, the Western, the Central, and Atlantic regions.
Le ministère est dirigé par notre ministre, récemment nommé l'honorable Diane Leboutillier, qui représente la circonscription de Gaspésie-les-Îles-de-la-Madeleine. L'équipe de direction comprend également la sous-ministre Annette Gibbons, le sous-ministre délégué Kevin Brousseau et le commissaire de la Garde côtière canadienne, Mario Pelletier. En plus de l'équipe de direction mentionnée ci-dessus et que vous voyez à l'écran, le MPO comprend aussi des sous-ministres adjoints pour les différents secteurs, ainsi que des directeurs généraux régionaux pour chaque région indiquée sur la carte que Ryan vous a montrée. Du côté de la garde côtière, on trouve des sous-commissaires pour les opérations et la construction navale et matérielle et des commissaires adjoints qui dirigent les employés régionaux.
Wonderful. And the department is celebrating several recent accomplishments, which includes the advancement of the Blue Economy strategy to build sustainable economic growth in Canada's oceans and freshwater sectors, the ongoing developments of reconciliation and relationship building, and all that it is done at the department. In addition to that as well, the establishment of marine conservation targets, which is 25% by 2025 and 30% by 2030, the enactment of the National Aquaculture Act, the renewal of the CCG fleet, and also the celebration of the 60th anniversary of the Canadian Coast Guard.
Thanks, Ryan. Alors maintenant que vous en savez un peu plus sur notre ministère, nous aimerions vous présenter nos panélistes d'aujourd'hui. So now that you know a little bit more about our department, we'd like to introduce you to today's panelists. Our first guest, Rick Vaughn. Depuis 2017, Rick travaille pour le MPO et la Garde côtière canadienne. Et actuellement, Rick est conseiller en politique auprès de la politique internationale des océans du MPO et travaille à l'obtention d'une maîtrise en affaires publiques et internationales à l'Université d'Ottawa. The floor is yours, Rick, to introduce yourself a little bit more to our audience.
Thanks so much. Yeah, really such a pleasure to be here with so many participants as well. This is awesome to be able to speak a little bit about what I do at Fisheries and Oceans. As Stacey mentioned, I've been there since 2017. I started right out of university with the Canadian Coast Guard before moving into the International Oceans Policy team that's under the strategic policy sector. I was also a part of the YPN as one of the co-chairs for 2 years at DFO, and really valued my time there and met so many different people. A lot of the work I do is typically related to oceans governance. So we work a lot on global oceans policy files, United Nations meetings. Personally, I work on mostly illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing and deep seabed mining, as well as bilateral relations between the UK and the EU, which I can get into a little bit later. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Rick. Up next on our panel of panelists is Amy Amos. Amy is a Gwich'in participant from Inuvik, Northwest Territories. Originally from Halifax, Nova Scotia, she holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Mount St. Vincent University and was very recently appointed the Associate Regional Director General of the Arctic region. Congratulations are in order for you, Amy, and the floor is yours.
Masi, thank you. Win Gwinzi, good day. So yeah, I guess thank you for that. Also, I guess just a little bit more on me. So my mom is Gwich'in, which Gwich'in are the most northern First Nation in Canada. Our northern neighbors are the Inuit, and in the Western Arctic, it's the Inuvialuit. Inuvik is a shared community between the Gwich'in and Inuvialuit people. I was born here, and but shortly after I was raised, I moved to Halifax with my father. My dad is non-Indigenous, and he has a mixed background, but mostly Scottish and English roots. I was raised there, and that's where I did my education. And I also started my career with DFO there as a student, and took advantage of some of the student networks at that time. But then moved back to Inuvik to reconnect with my roots and work for a co-management board here. And then just under 2 years ago, I started with DFO here in the Inuvik office. So I'm happy to be here today and look forward to the questions you may have.
Thank you, Amy, very much for your introduction as well. And our final panelist today is Sean Arbour. Alors, Sean a commencé à travailler à la Garde côtière canadienne en 2009 et a obtenu son diplôme du Collège de la Garde côtière canadienne en 2013. Il a travaillé dans les opérations de la flotte, la recherche et le sauvetage et l'administration du programme national. Il est actuellement gestionnaire national pour l'administration de projets de recherche et de sauvetage. À toi la parole, Sean, pour te présenter davantage.
Merci, Stacey. Bonjour, tout le monde. What an honor to be joining you today, and especially next to panelists like Amy and Rick. I feel very privileged and humbled by that. So once again, my name is Sean Arbour. I'm joining you from the unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq. I am the National Manager of Search and Rescue Project Oversight for Coast Guard, which means we manage projects that are related to search and rescue specifically, and look at the risks that we identify in the maritime environment in order to implement ways to mitigate that risk and help people that are on the waters. I can provide you a little more detail as we get into it on what those projects entail, but I am very happy to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. So now you've had the chance to meet our three panelists. And before we begin the audience portion of the session, we had a few questions of our own to ask Amy, Rick, and Sean. Alors maintenant que vous avez eu la chance de rencontrer nos panélistes aujourd'hui, et avant de commencer la portion des questions du public, nous avons quelques questions pour Amy, Sean et Rick.
Right, but I guess just to kick things off, you want to meet you where you are right now. So we wanted to kick off this discussion with what projects or initiatives that you are currently involved in your work. Quels sont les projets ou les initiatives auxquelles vous participez actuellement?
Ryan, was it for me?
Let's start with you, Sean.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Sure.
There's a few projects that stand out right from the get-go. I do a project that's called Risk-Based Analysis of Maritime Search and Rescue Delivery. So once again, as we kind of go into the new age of emergency management worldwide, understanding what the issues are becomes more and more complex, and being able to perform the job of, in my case, saving lives at sea is something that needs to be informed by risk statistics. And although I would have disagreed with my calculus teacher back in high school as to the value of statistics at the time, my passion was really being on the water. I do actually very much value my job now and assessing how we get that information, that granular information, and inform how we save lives at sea. So that's one of the primary projects. Another one that is near and dear to my heart is that of Indigenous search and rescue training. So in recognizing that a lot of the hazards that happen on the ocean and the impacts that those have on people are more related to the vulnerability and the resilience of those peoples, as opposed to the actual inclement weather or possible hazards that they're exposed to, we've started to really analyze how we shift from a organized governmental response to providing the capacity, knowledge, material, and assets to people who are at that risk or exposed to that risk in order for them to affect their own outcomes. Indigenous search and rescue training allows us to provide that capacity to Indigenous communities across Canada, and essentially provide the know-how and the capacity for them to affect their own outcomes and have the self-determination to respond to events that affect their communities. So in a nutshell, that's essentially ISAR, Indigenous Search and Rescue. And finally, and Amy would be aware of this, there is a very long road ahead of us in the Arctic, and recognizing that we have very well established operations Canada-wide. The Arctic truly has some of the most complex conditions for search and rescue specifically, and many other things, but through the lens of what I do, the very narrow lens, there is the Arctic Marine Response Station in Rankin Inlet, which aims to be one of the first comprehensive answers to community-based search and rescue response in the Arctic, and a model that we hope to deploy Arctic-wide that would be to a certain extent different from what we do in the rest of the country, but more so an adaptive way forward to the challenges we see in the Arctic that are so unique. And that's just three of the main ones, and I think I'll leave it at that because we could speak all day.
Thank you, Sean. And before continuing on to either Rick or Amy to add, juste pour réitérer un peu qu'est-ce que Sean vient juste de dire. Alors, il y a 3 projets qui sont de priorité en ce moment. Le premier étant le niveau de calcul de risque au niveau de sauver les vies sur l'eau, l'importance de ceci. Ensuite, il a mentionné comme quoi un projet qui est très, très cher à son cœur étant la recherche et sauvetage avec les communautés autochtones. Et finalement, en ce moment, en reconnaissant que l'Arctique est un climat très difficile et un des climats les plus difficiles à travailler dedans, ils ont un modèle en ce moment à Rankin Inlet qui essaie de déployer au restant de l'Arctique pour les autres communautés autochtones aussi. So, Amy, would you like to tell us a little bit more about projects and initiatives that you're currently involved in?
Sure, thanks. I should note that I have been getting a few pop-ups that are saying that my internet is unstable, so hopefully that doesn't cut out. So yeah, I think I'll speak to my role from when I've been with DFO for the past 2 years as Director of Arctic Operations for DFO Arctic Region. I recently accepted a role as the Associate Regional Director General, but I'm still just sort of getting into that. So for Arctic operations, it's mostly dealing with Indigenous relations and partnerships. So we are building a program that is aimed to focus on meeting the department's reconciliation initiatives. So a lot of these things we are working in partnership with Coast Guard. When we showed the map earlier in the PowerPoint presentation, you could see that the DFO and Coast Guard maps for the Arctic were the same. So we're really working together with them in a lot of these initiatives. So an example is we're forming governance committees with Indigenous partners across the Arctic, which includes the entire Inuit Nunungat, the 4 Inuit partners, as well as First Nation and Métis partners across the Arctic region. We're also working with Coast Guard on developing a northern recruitment and retention strategy, and that's looking at the lens of the Arctic region is really looking at for the North, by the North approach. And we're also looking at staffing community engagement coordinators throughout the Arctic region. And the idea here is that there would be people located in each of the regions across the Arctic region. And when I say regions, I mean like closely connected with the communities and able to attend meetings, make connections at the community level, and help communicate those priorities throughout the department. So I think I'll stop there for some of the projects that we're working on right now. Merci, thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Amy. Alors, avant de poursuivre avec Rick, alors juste pour faire une petite traduction rapide. Alors, comme Amy vient de dire, elle vient d'accepter un nouveau rôle en étant la directrice générale régionale pour la région de l'Arctique. Et puis, il y a beaucoup de travail qui se fait avec la mobilisation, le partenariat avec les communautés et beaucoup de travail qui se fait avec la garde côtière, effectivement, dans le Nord, beaucoup de programmes qui s'en viennent. So, Rick, now
Awesome.
to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so as I mentioned before, I'm part of the International Oceans Policy team. So we're kind of the international branch for DFO. So we work on a ton of different international initiatives or work through global bodies like the UN or other groups of nations that have come together to sort of decide on working on specific issues. So one of those issues I mentioned was illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. So that's a huge drain on the economy. It takes up a lot of there's a lot of overfishing. There's a lot of other crimes that are associated with IUU fishing. So we work with other countries to try and clamp down on that and try and find ways to mitigate it and eliminate it. So I work on policy related to that. I also, one of my main files are the bilateral relations between the EU and the UK. So that's working with both of those well, the EU and the UK to kind of coordinate on positions in global bodies, kind of come up with alignment on different policies, how we can work better together to come up with new initiatives to achieve our mutual objectives. And then the big thing that probably takes up most of my time is seabed mining. So a little explainer for seabed mining. At the bottom of the ocean, there are these nodules, they're called, and they're essentially rocks, and they're filled with critical minerals. So cobalt, nickel, magnesium, essentially things that would be really useful to put into batteries or cell phones or electric vehicles. So obviously there's a lot of demand right now to harvest those nodules. Two problems with that is one, they're 4,000 meters deep on the bottom of the ocean. So how do you actually get down there? Two, what happens when you can actually get down there? Is it going to be destroying a lot of biodiversity? A lot of this really important undiscovered life that's at the bottom of the ocean. So that's what I do. I work with Global Affairs Canada to bring in some subject matter expertise and help develop regulations through a body of the UN called the International Seabed Authority. So right now there's regulations being drafted. If this is going to go ahead, what's the safety levels? How much, how many species are we going to be able to survey down there? What sorts of rules and regulations and laws are going to be applied to those contractors that actually want to take those critical minerals off the bottom of the seafloor? And above all, Canada believes, we shouldn't be going down there unless we can prove that there's not going to be significant harm to the marine life. So that's from a DFO perspective, that's really our main focus there. Hopefully that's not too much for you to translate there, Stacy. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. Alors, Rick aussi est très occupé avec ses projets en ce moment. Alors, il nous a mentionné comme quoi un des gros projets qui s'occupe, c'est justement la pêche illégale au pays et essayer de l'éliminer et la mitiger. Il nous a parlé aussi des relations bilatérales entre l'Union européenne et le Royaume-Uni et de participer à ce niveau international. Et finalement, un des gros projets qui prend de la place en ce moment, c'est l'exploitation minière des fonds marins. Il y a une grosse demande en ce moment. Par contre, il travaille avec Affaires mondiales Canada. Il y a beaucoup de certains problèmes, considérant qu'ils sont à 4000 mètres souterrains et c'est comment se rendre et niveau difficulté. Alors, encore beaucoup de pain sur la planche, comme on dit. Alors, on va maintenant poursuivre avec notre deuxième question. And so, you've touched upon it a little bit in your introductions and some of your projects initiatives, but how does Indigenous knowledge inform your work? Alors, comment, on sait que vous en avez mentionné un petit peu lors de vos introductions, en parlant de vos projets et initiatives, mais comment est-ce que les connaissances autochtones influencent votre travail? Alors, Amy, on peut débuter avec toi. So, Amy, we can start with yourself.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So, with Indigenous knowledge, I think there's a lot of examples that we can share on how we're doing this. I'm mostly familiar with the northern environment where we have a lot of land claim agreements. So we have strong partnerships with the co-management boards in these regions. And I think a good example of how Indigenous knowledge is being incorporated into decision making is those partnerships. So I can give you an example of a project that I was involved in, both from the DFO side since I've been here, but even prior to that, when I was on the co-management side, is the Rat River Dolly Varden char population. It migrates throughout the Nubialuit and the Gwich'in settlement regions. So there's 2 land claim agreements. There's also 2 co-management boards, and then there's DFO and Parks Canada that all work together to manage those stocks. And what I find really interesting about that process is that it's very community driven. So way back in the 90s, there were concerns from local fishermen that they saw a decline in the char population. And from there, the groups formed a working group that meets annually. And they, so DFO comes into play by some of the science work that is done. But they also trained local fishermen, char monitors, to who are already fishing from their traditional camps along the migration route. They train them on some of the biological sample collection, and they monitor these stocks. And it's a very long data set of information. And every year these groups come together. So it's fishermen, monitors, community members, regional co-management boards, DFO, Parks Canada, all come together and talk about what the previous fishing season was like. And then they make voluntary recommendations, which have included in the past voluntary closures that had a high compliance, and also voluntary total allowable catch limits. So to me, that's like a really strong example of how community knowledge and traditional and Indigenous knowledge can inform decision making. I feel like it's a very community-driven process too. Also within DFO Arctic region, within the Arctic operations program that I was the director of for the past 2 years, we're working on developing an Indigenous knowledge unit that would be looking at policies and frameworks to capture this as well, how Indigenous knowledge should be and can be and will be included in decision making. Masi, thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Amy. Donc, comme Amy vient juste de dire, elle nous a donné un exemple comme quoi que les connaissances autochtones influencent le travail. Alors, dans une des communautés, justement, il y avait désolée. Il y avait une inquiétude comme quoi que l'ombre le chevalier serait peut-être, il y aurait une diminution de population. Comment contrer ceci? Alors, les communautés autochtones, les pêcheurs sont venus, c'est eux qui ont éduqué justement les communautés, les pêcheurs commerciaux. Il y a des gens de différents ministères qui se sont joints aussi pour justement apprendre et de savoir et de comprendre les différents niveaux de stock de poissons, comment ils sont affectés et qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire justement pour mitiger le déclin de cette population. Alors, c'est vraiment un exemple de comment les communautés autochtones et leurs connaissances, tous les gens peuvent venir se rassembler ensemble et travailler pour trouver une solution au problème. All right, so moving to Rick, same question.
Sure. Yeah, so our team often discusses issues with Indigenous organizations in advance of global meetings. Sometimes we even have them join on the delegation if that's possible. So for example, I was coordinating the 2022 United Nations Oceans Conference, and we had an Indigenous representative join our delegation then. And it was really great because we had the minister on our delegation as well. So they were able to advise the minister, provide some recommendations on some of the key issues for them, and really just be able to kind of align Canada's approach to that conference with Indigenous views in mind. So that's one way. And then I think the other way, if I'm going to relate it to the Seabed Authority, there's obviously a ton of Indigenous views on this with their connections to the ocean. And then you also have a lot of Pacific Islanders who would consider themselves Indigenous as well. And they often show up to these meetings. They often, provide their connection to the ocean, just really present their case as to why we should be protecting this space and this nature and how much it means to them to have the ocean clean and healthy. So there's often quite a lot of Indigenous knowledge brought into these conversations that we have, and I often think that we're benefiting quite a lot from it. So thanks. I believe you're on mute.
CC, you're on mute, sorry.
Thank you. Alors, pour réitérer qu'est-ce que Rick vient juste de dire, même au niveau international, il y a beaucoup de discussions qui se font avec justement les Premières Nations, les communautés, pour avoir cette vision, ces connaissances à apporter au côté international, pas seulement national dans le pays. Et niveau, surtout au côté exploitation minière des fonds marins, ça fait partie de l'importance de conserver et de protéger les ressources, avoir un océan qui est propre et qu'on peut justement continuer à pêcher dedans. Alors, finalement, Sean, je te remets la même question.
See, Stacey. Folks, I think maybe just give you a little bit of context on where my background applies to this question. So I first joined the Canadian Coast Guard in order to be on the water, to serve the public. Those things were all meaningful to me. In working in the East Coast of Africa to build capacity in search and rescue training and doing my graduate degree in emergency management, I realized that I had a place in offering self-determination and capacity to communities that needed it. At first, I also did not realize that Canada, I think I had my blinders on, and that being part of a colonialist system and established systems that we need to break down in order to provide that capacity. In thinking that in Canada, we did not have kind of the issues that they might have worldwide in the lack of capacity to affect their own outcomes. And how that circles back to this question, well, our work now, and certainly my work specifically, largely centers around adapting how we can do our work differently in order for it to benefit our Indigenous partners Canada-wide. So in search and rescue specifically, if we think about how we deploy search and rescue, we are a country that is known to do it very well. Unfortunately, how we do it for our Indigenous partners has been historically inadequate. And so a lot of the projects we have now have happened in recognition of the fact that we need to adapt not only what we see as far as gaps and vulnerability metrics in those communities and how we haven't shown up before, but also in recognizing that what we know about search and rescue historically and how it applies to the public in general is not necessarily compatible with how it needs to be done in Indigenous communities. So specifically earlier, I mentioned Indigenous search and rescue training is one of my projects, and risk-based analysis of maritime search and rescue. Those are both highly informed by how we should implement search and rescue so that it benefits Indigenous communities across Canada. In Indigenous search and rescue training, for example, there are ways that we do things, the way that we train things in community, they're actually starkly different from how we do them operationally in Canadian Coast Guard. One thing that is quite elevated in Indigenous communities, as an example, is the idea that you have small communities where even the first responders respond directly to incidents that involve people that they know, people that are important to them. For the most part, if you work in a city like Halifax, for example, if you respond to an incident, it's highly unlikely you'll be responding to someone you know. If you think about that effect on the first responder when they are doing it with families and friends, there's a recognition that mental and emotional health support needs to be offered alongside response capacity. And so we look at that as components of search and rescue in general, and we apply those to how we would deploy them in community by listening to those communities first and foremost. And second, handing over the determination, or the the control to that community to affect those components themselves. So we would be remiss really if we tried to just apply what we know elsewhere. The idea is to provide the knowledge and asset capacity to communities in search and rescue so that they may perform search and rescue in a way that responds to their risk metrics and improves their outcomes.
Excellent answer. Thank you as well. Alors, juste pour traduire, alors quand Sean a commencé, il voulait être sur l'eau, mais qu'il ne réalisait pas justement comme quoi qu'il y avait peut-être des problèmes au niveau du déploiement des recherches et sauvetage, surtout dans les communautés. Et en lien avec son travail, justement, ils travaillent en collaboration avec les communautés pour comment mieux gérer ces recherches sauvetage-là pour les déployer. Alors, tout en réalisant que qu'est-ce qui se fait pour, par exemple, une ville, un village, etc., ne sera pas la même chose que si on déploie dans les communautés qui sont plus à l'extérieur ou les communautés autochtones. Alors, merci beaucoup, Sean, Amy, et Rick. Thank you very much to the three of you for answering our questions. And now with the time that we have, we'll switch over to the audience portion of the session. And we have quite a few questions to get through. Unfortunately, folks, we won't be able to answer them all, but we will try our best to answer a few. And those that don't get answered, well, we'll be in touch with Finn to try to get those answers to you. So to begin, and this I think was also a question we have, and I think it's an important one. Do you have any recommendations on how to get hired, or recommendations for students graduating, young professionals, or even young established professionals within the department? Or any tips and tricks or suggestions as to advice for our audience members?
Hey, Stacey, I'll jump in very quickly. With search and rescue specifically, and this really does extend to Coast Guard at large, we have a program called the Inshore Rescue Boat Program, which is essentially only available to students. So you would apply for this program and essentially be trained into search and rescue capacity in order to operate a search and rescue vessel your first year. It is a seasonal, essentially seasonal program. It's mainly geared towards university students. And the idea is you start at the end of your academic year, do the job throughout the summer, and the hours are quite long, but the job is incredible. In fact, if I could go back and choose one job in the Coast Guard that I would do again, is that, but I'm no longer a student, no longer eligible, and it would end essentially September long weekend before people enter school again. So keep that one in mind for sure, and we're always looking for good candidates for that one.
Awesome, thank you, Sean. And if you have any, we can get that info off the Coast Guard website, but if you have any information to share with the group, that'd be great. Feel free to post that as well. I guess Amy or Rick, if there's anything you'd like to add to that.
Sure. So in addition to like the government jobs website, I think like I always encourage people to try to make connections with people working in the local offices if possible. They just might be able to connect you or know of an opening. And I think we recognize sometimes that job site is not as easy to navigate. In the north, in the Arctic region, we recognize that connectivity issues sometimes like is a barrier for people applying for jobs or seeing the job advertisements. And so we encourage people to reach out by email to just see if there's any openings. And for myself, how I was able to get into getting a student job with DFO when I was in university was in high school. I attended an Indigenous conference and there was a career booth, and I reached out to somebody at the DFO Coast Guard booth and was able to make that connection and got a tour of the institute. And then I was able to apply to a summer student position. And after that, once I was in there, then there was some casual opportunities while I was going part-time while I was going to university, which was helpful. And then I guess like my advice is just to try to make those connections in addition to the networks. For Indigenous employees, we do have a program called the Career Navigators Program, and it's fairly new, I think, over the past year, but it's my understanding that they would provide assistance to Indigenous people wanting to enter the federal government and provide advice to them and help them with that. So thank you.
I would just echo that. I think those are all really good tips. And I think, there's the traditional routes, jobs.gc.ca. I would give a little tip for that. Probably good idea to maybe start up like a Google Docs or something with all of the different answers and responses in there. So you can have those for future times you apply to job postings. It's a learned skill going through those job postings on jobs.gc. So I think that would help you a lot. Also, agreed. I think connecting with people is probably the best way. Don't feel afraid to, reach out to people, go up and talk to people. Everybody's usually quite friendly. And, that's often just such a good way of learning what the department does anyways. And then the other tip I would probably have is if you do have an opportunity, you could look at the job that you're focused on or interested in, see what requirements are there, and then you could maybe speak with someone to give you some experience doing that. So say you'd like to get into a policy position, perhaps you could ask to write a couple policy papers, or just try and build up that knowledge and show that you have that experience. So I think a lot of people will be really understanding of that. Yeah, I think, oh, there was one more thing too. I saw a lot of comments, do I have to have a specific qualification to get into DFO? Or, we have a huge department. There's tons of different positions. There's tons of different jobs all over the country. You can probably find something for yourself. I come from a communications background. I did a lot of stakeholder relations. I didn't plan on doing international work, but that's just how my path had found me. So, I think you can make yourself fit into a lot of the different experiences if you're just really interested in it and you love it and you're passionate about it, and you speak with people and you network. So just would encourage all of you to go for it.
Thank you all. Great answers to this question. And I think there's a lot of, as I was going through the Q&As, you've hit on a lot of those questions as well in that broad sense. And to just add as well, one of the questions that did come up was how to get involved in extracurricular activities. And this is just a small plug for the YPN or the professional networks. Most departments do have YPNs, and that's a really great place to start. Reach out to the community, the committee members, the co-chair and whatnot, and they'll be glad to help you. I know we are on our side of it in our department, so don't hesitate to reach out to your young or your professional networks. And although, again, to echo, we are a huge department, yes, there's a lot of it that's science-based, but we are more than just a science-based department. There is a need for social scientists, for finances, the human aspect of it. So it's not because you don't have a science degree that you can't work for Fisheries and Oceans Canada. All right. This might be a little geared towards yourself, Sean, but even Rick, with your international experience, does CCG/DFO respond to crises in neighboring countries like the US, for instance?
Yeah, so essentially, we'll talk from the lens of maritime response to begin with. So we have a multitude of countries that have waters that abut against ours as far as search and rescue responsibility goes. Typically, the understanding is that we all take care of search and rescue events in our own waters. But given the collaborative relationship between these countries, if we can, certainly in events where the assets are not sufficient in any given country to respond to a disaster and event, our country will assist, and we expect the same. Typically, I found it in my career at Coast Guard that collaboration has been very effective and very seamless. We all speak generally the same language when it comes to search and rescue response, and by that I mean not literal language, but there is a standardization to how we perform SAR. So we do assist in other countries, whether it's direct response or capacity building, and we expect the same certainly in events where our capacity is overwhelmed.
Very good. Just looking at the time, we do have maybe time for one final question, and then we'll wrap up our session. Alors, comment circule l'information entre toutes les branches du ministère? Est-ce qu'il y a des liens opérationnels entre les différentes équipes? Alors, how does information circulate between all the different branches and teams, sectors within the department? And are there any operational links between these different teams? Considering all three of you are from different teams themselves, how does that best come up in your work? Amy, would you like to take that question, or someone else?
I can probably jump in. Actually, I have an example. I'm starting some work next week in the Labrador Coastal Search and Rescue. And I have folks that I work with on a week-to-week for the last several years that are from the RCMP, Parks Canada, Canadian Armed Forces, all these public safety, other members just outside of Coast Guard and DFO. All these folks inform how we do our work in the scope of search and rescue. We actually all have a responsibility to perform search and rescue. Our mandates say as much. And so when I go into a community to do some engagement in order to think specifically search and rescue, I often have all of these colleagues in the room with me, and we speak on a weekly basis. So operationally, we are tied very closely. In fact, I would argue that a lot of my job could not be done unless these folks were on weekly calls with me. And so although we have organizations, the all of government approach kind of dictates that we do that work hand in hand with the other agencies that look at the same type of picture.
Great example. Thank you. I don't know if Rick or Amy, you wanted to add anything, or?
Yeah, I it's quite similar. Obviously, a lot of the work we do is we engage our science colleagues, and depending on what the file or the issue is, that could mean science colleagues from within DFO, or it could mean Environment Canada or Natural Resources Canada. And typically we'll have working level contacts. So those other departments will usually have an international branch that we can work through. Or if we're working through our own science, we'll typically have a couple contacts at the working level there, but we would also have deputy or director general contacts, director contacts, or even associate deputy minister contacts who will be speaking with their counterparts in the other sectors, perhaps bi-weekly or something, and we can brief up on any issues that we'd like them to discuss. So information gets around, and typically the best way to do it is through your working level contacts. So once again, build those networks.
Awesome. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah, thanks. So this is something that we're working on within DFO Arctic region. We have a team within Arctic operations that's focusing on engagement. We do have some tracking systems within DFO that tracks engagement with particularly Indigenous communities and partners and co-management boards. So when we hear when we're engaging with partners, if one program is doing that engagement, this tracking system, the concept of it is that it's helping to share that information, so we know who's going into the communities and when, and what were the main priorities or concerns that were shared in those meetings. So the idea is it is a mechanism that we're trying to be more coordinated between programs. We also have regular program meetings where we share like anything that's urgent or things that we want to share with other programs, and we are doing our best to try to be more coordinated as a department, particularly when we're all working in the same communities. So thank you for the question.
Perfect, merci beaucoup. Alors, entre autres, c'est beaucoup de discussions entre l'équipe directe, les gestionnaires, etc., mais aussi, tel que Amy disait, avoir un système de suivi en place pour justement savoir qui est allé dans quelle communauté, qui a parlé à qui, pour justement un peu plus être au courant, qui était présent, sujet de discussion, etc. Alors, c'est beaucoup de suivi, mais oui, effectivement, il y a beaucoup de discussions entre équipes pour pouvoir avoir des meilleurs suivis, être capable de répondre aux demandes plus efficacement. Alors, avec ceci, malheureusement, on n'a pas pu répondre à toutes les questions du public, mais nous allons essayer de faire notre mieux pour pouvoir les ravoir du réseau. Alors, merci beaucoup pour votre participation et votre engagement aujourd'hui. Et évidemment, une fois encore, merci à Sean, Amy et Rick qui ont fait un travail formidable pour représenter le ministère. Et encore une fois, merci au réseau des jeunes fonctionnaires fédéraux d'avoir organisé l'événement d'aujourd'hui. So thank you very much and back to you, Guillaume.
Merci beaucoup, Stacy. Merci, Ryan. Et je ne vais pas oublier nos panélistes aussi, Rick, Amy, et puis Sean. Thank you so much for joining us today. As mentioned, the chat resources are available on our wiki page, and the recording of this session will be available on our YouTube channel. Merci encore. Ainsi prend fin saison 2 de Ministère sous les projecteurs. Et puis, ouais, Ryan, yeah. On peut applaudir là. On peut tous applaudir. Merci encore et puis à l'année prochaine. Merci. Bye bye. Thank you.